Okay. So when I start, of course, half square triangles, you're always going to start with your squares, light and dark, whatever you're choosing for your half square triangles. And then I actually mark on the wrong side of the lightest one. Light, dark, I don't know if it really matters, but I like my rough board. So the rough board is just a rough surface, kind of like the old sandpaper boards used to be, but this is a much smoother surface, so it's not going to get all bumpy. And I then will just mark the 1/4 inch on either side. I also use a bow and chalk pencil. Number one, I think the chalk is just less likely to bleed through anything you're doing, whether that's true or not. Of course, that didn't mark very well. Let's do that again. I just put the new lead in here, so it's probably, so again, I mark on the one. Okay. So now I've got both my 1/4 inches marked, my sew lines marked. And so then I'm going to take it on up to the machine, layer it, of course, right sides together. Take it on up to the machine and actually sew on both of those lines. So this one I've already got done sewing on. Now I cut it apart, and what I do is I just take a pair of scissors and cut through there. But again, you just really have to make sure your scissors don't slip and cut into your seam line at all. But I just cut it apart with scissors. That's good enough for me. If you really want to you can do it with a rotary cutter and ruler. And so then you got 2 half square triangles. So this one I've already squared up, but I'll show you on this one how I do that. You got your half square triangle. You can see it's a little wonky. Now I want to square these up to 2.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is find on my ruler the 2.5 inch mark. I like a ruler that is kind of easy enough to handle. So I like the little bit smaller one, but I want it bigger than the square I'm actually cut out. I also like this 45-degree line because I can line that right up on my seam line there. And then I'm going to just take the rotary cutter. I'll stand up on this one because I'm afraid if I sit down, I'll cut my finger off. I just cut either side of that. Oops, let's get that little corner out of there. I'm then gonna flip it over once again. Now I can see where my 2.5 is on my ruler there, and I've got nice square line here. Line those up, and again that line just runs right up the center. Now I'm going to cut off the other 2 sides. I used to do this where I never cut them. That's when I first started quilting. I thought, oh, what's that little bit of difference? But boy, do they come out wonky if you don't. So I do find that cutting them up really works well. So that's a 2.5 square triangle. So half square triangle. So do you have any questions on it, Judy?
So back on the first time you put the ruler on, how do you know that? Like, I understand getting the 45-degree line on it, but how do you know you're not too far down or up?
Well, on this ruler, there's 2.5 inch marking on this one.
Okay.
So when I do it, I actually try to do it. Now, of course, this one's cut, so it's a little bit. Let's try it on. And I can't do it on that. So what I try to do is I line up that ruler, and I try to make sure that when I'm first cutting it, that I'll have, let's say we're going to square this down to 2. We'll just do that. We'll try to square it down to 2. So what I do is I line up that 45 in the center, and I just make sure that there's extra on all sides, whether it be a little bit extra because my square only allows that, whether it be equal, it doesn't matter to me. I just try to make sure that there's something extra on each side to cut off. That way I know it's going to get evened out. So and here, I've got that. I've got my 2 here. This side is bigger, this side is narrow, but there's still something over here. So then I'm going to, again, cut. And then I'm going to go back and flip that around. Now I've got the 2 inch here. And now I can, now I can. When I want to do it, I can't. But now I can actually line up the 2 here, line up that center. So on that second time around, you have a nice point to line up into. And now I'm going to just cut out all that excess there. So now I have a 2 inch half square triangle. Now remember, when you're cutting like this, they're going to be your unfinished size. So when I sew this in, it's actually going to sew down to 1.5 inch. So you really have to see what your instructions are telling you. When I start with the square to begin with, I always cut it at least 7/8 to to 3. So when I started with this, I wanted a 2.5 finished. So I will cut these squares anywhere from 2 7/8 to 3 inches, just enough to allow me to do my lines, to cut it up. Because again, if I had wanted to cut those down to 2 and I had all this excess, it's a lot of fabric to waste. So I try to do as little as possible extra to waste, but enough that's going to allow a nice square up. So.
Okay. That's really helpful. And I always struggled with, like, I understood getting it on the 45-degree line on that center line, but I never really knew, I don't know why I wouldn't, but I just thought, well, am I cutting too much off here? And am I going to have enough left there? So just visually make sure there's plenty all around.
There's something all the way around so that you can square it up nice. And when I do these little half square triangles like this and sew them and then cut them apart, sometimes I have one that has quite a bit around one side for some reason, and the next one has very little. And I guess it's probably just in the how I started it, how I sewed, whatever. Did I make this line a little fatter than that line type of situation? And so it's just need to make sure that you have something around all of it when you do that first cut. So
okay. Well, that's really good advice.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Now,
yes.
you're gonna video or go through this and take out all those bloopers.
Roxy did not bark. Don't know what was going on there. Let's see, what else was I going to ask you? So the rough board, is that something you buy or do you make one? Or
you can definitely make one. We make them and sell them. So, I mean, if it's something you're not into making or doing, when we did it, we found a product that's actually not super rough. The old rough boards were a sandpaper board, and a lot of people use the coarse sandpaper because that's what they had or could find. Well, you go to draw over it and your pencil jumps along the line and everything. So this is really kind of a smooth surface, but rough enough to hold the fabric. And then we also put it onto a masonite type of board, so it gives it a nice steady. So sometimes if I have a lot of half square triangles to do, I will sit down like in front of the TV at night and do them. And because the board is nice and steady, I can just sit there pretty much on my lap and do them type of situation. So again, if you're making one for yourself, I would say just make sure that sandpaper isn't too coarse and that you have a firm surface on the back so that you can actually utilize it where you want to go. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
And did you say you sell them? Are they on your website?
Do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they are on the website. So yeah.
All right.
And they're called a rough board. I know when I sell them at shows and stuff, people will go, "Well, that's like a sandpaper board. Why do you call it a rough board?" And I'm like, "Well, because I didn't want to call it a sandpaper board." So it is called a rough board.
Okay. All right. Well, that's wonderful. Well, I can't really think of anything else. That was a wonderful demonstration.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure how it was all going to work, so I wanted to get all the little parts moving so we didn't take a lot of time doing them. But yeah.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.